Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Beau Taillefer and Eric Rasmussen. Season 3, Episode 10, Special Guest Emily Moscoe. So, hi, Emily.
Hi.
It's nice to see you. We met online, and you sold me a book from Chris Azera and Dick Grunow's Developing Musicianship Through Improvisation.
Yes, so I still need to read the book because I bought the wrong copy.
So I can't wait to get the book. Thank you. We saved a couple shekels, not having to buy a new one. But I do want to have it for reference. Chris Azera actually is the one that probably instigated where my harmonic learning sequence came from, just from one of his talks at a conference. And I was like, well, this makes sense. Bass lines, or I think he called them bass lines then. They weren't root melodies yet. But they are root melodies because they're not bass lines, because bass lines could have extra notes in them. But we've covered some of that. But Beau and I were talking after you and I met. It's like we haven't spoken to too many people who are audiators in the wild. That's the name of the podcast, this episode. Audiator in the Wild, Emily Moscoe. So you want to give us just a little background for the listeners, and then we'll see where this conversation goes.
Sure, and hopefully my recording stays stable. It's telling me unstable internet. Sorry. Well, we'll see how this goes. So you said my name's Emily Moscoe. So I am a piano teacher and musician out in Southern California. I got my bachelor's degree in composition back in 2011 at UC Santa Barbara. And I actually started there as a piano performance major. I did the whole classical piano, build up your repertoire for a year, go to festivals and evaluations, like the whole thing as a kid. But long before that, I was audiating as a young child. I actually remember it very vividly, being 2 years old and watching my Disney movies, be it Bambi or Snow White. And then my parents had this old, it had to be pre-1850s dance hall antique piano that it was piece of crap. But I knew it was a musical instrument, and I went over and I just started figuring out the melodies that I had been hearing. And I think my mom was floored. I don't remember the exact first time I was doing that, but I do have distinct memories of figuring out the raindrop song from The Storm and Bambi, and the main love theme from Snow White and all that stuff. And I think that pretty quickly snowballed into filling out the left hand and getting more rhythmic. And I have these really clear memories of just improvising, getting to the point where okay, I know where all the sounds are, and just playing just for the pure fun of it and just being in that zone. And pretty quickly after that, my parents got me into piano lessons, and totally understandable why. But I do think, as much as I obviously got out of formal training, there was a big piece of that because it was very traditional, here's your Bastion books, and you're going to learn here's middle C, and that improvisation, it kind of got squashed quickly. And I remember spending years trying to get back to that feeling on the piano.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, anyway,
Well, I think that's really common.
Yeah.
I was actually writing about that for something I'm working on. I'm writing about how, different musical cultures, there's great audiators in every musical culture, whether it's pop music or classical music. It's not a genre thing necessarily where all the good audiators are hiding out in. Some people might have more chops, jazz musicians tend to have more chops for playing over certain kinds of chord progressions, but audiators are great in all the genres, but some genres specifically do not encourage improvisation, especially traditional classical piano specifically. I would say even more than, I mentioned this on the podcast, classical guitarists often do improvise because guitar teachers tend to cross genres more, and there's more jazz or rock or whatever. But I've seen this so much in classical piano where the improv is not really brought up a lot unless you have a teacher who happens to just be a composer / improviser. So it's really hit and miss in that specific context. And I'm not surprised at all, that was your experience.
Oh yeah, no, I have an awful lot of opinions on traditional piano teaching. I could dive into. Yeah, so I am now a piano teacher. Have been for 14 years, and I knew pretty darn quickly getting into it that I wanted to do things very differently than how I had been brought up musically. Yeah, a lot of the stuff that I've heard you guys mention on the podcast, and I've heard other MLTers mention, like several years ago, I threw out the method books. I was just done with it. I had tried Alfred and Faber and all the typical ones, and there's lots of great stuff in there. I'm not trying to diss them, but I could just tell it wasn't getting my students where I wanted them to be. So actually, very much like what you've talked about, Beau, a lot of my lessons are, let's just start with a song that the kid wants to do. Let's start with where is that kernel of inspiration for them and start to unpack it and break it down. But I've found MLT has been so great as far as sequencing that for me, because I was always just naturally good at doing that on my own. But as far as understanding how to do that for somebody that isn't naturally audiating, I needed that guidance.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's such a good point. And there's some problems that arise instrumentally with doing this for sure. And I have nothing against, I'm a classical guitarist. I have nothing against classical guitar or method books and all that kind of stuff. I'm even open to some decoding. I haven't totally swallowed the red pill yet, but I think you have to be very careful about how you do it. And I much prefer the 4x4ing approach, in the sense where, what do you want to learn? And I know a lot of songs. I'm just sequencing the lessons. But if you have MLT, at least brings this perspective where you can keep an eye on where someone is tonally and rhythmically. So even if they want to learn a song that's kind of above their ability or whatever, you can always make sure they're progressing in fundamental ways that will translate into different things. And that's something that, I've seen other teachers who try to go 4x4ing in lessons where there's no method book or anything like that. And without that kind of fundamentals, okay, we have some tonal patterns that are building, we have some rhythm or whatever it is, right? It doesn't have like a coherence to it, long range, that I think you can get when you keep an eye on things. I tend to not even track what I'm doing in lessons anymore, other than the tonal patterns we're working on, because I find rhythm patterns kind of just get absorbed by everyone at some point, but the tonal side can be a little, it's a little more complicated.
It is, and
Did you run? I was just going to ask you, did you run into music moves for piano at all along your travels?
Oh, yeah. So my first formal experience with MLT was this last June. I did a 1-week summer online program through Gimmel that Krista Yadro and Jenny Fisher were teaching specifically on using music moves for piano. I have the entire curriculum. Great. I think Marilyn Lowe was doing some amazing stuff, and I've been slowly absorbing all of that and trying to integrate a lot of that into my lessons. I definitely see her books as being like musicianship books, that I don't want them to be exclusively what I use in lessons. And I don't think she meant it to be that way anyway. She wants you to supplement and do other things too. But yeah. So yes, I have looked into music moves. I own them. I'm working on absorbing it, and I'm talking with the main figures with Gimmel that train on those books.
Yeah, awesome. Tell me, because I have such a strong early childhood need, what was going on in utero with you? What was mom or dad or family doing before you were born? Was there got to be something? Because
nothing that I am aware of. My mother would be the first to tell you that she doesn't think she's musical at all. I think she probably would just need like some guidance through some of those beginning steps of the sequence. But my father has always been very naturally musical. He never had really any formal training though, so it was a lot of like self-taught on the guitar and just singing along, and like clearly very musical. But no one was holding up headphones to my mom's stomach with Mozart or anything like that. My parents would listen to music in the house sometimes, but it wasn't. I don't think there was the emphasis back then. It was the 1980s, so it wasn't the same. focus now of like, oh, make your baby listen to classical music so they'll have a 200 IQ, or like that just wasn't that wasn't a parenting thing back then.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's just children before they're born recognize melodies right after they're born, and are obviously comforted by the mom's voice and those kinds of things. There's clearly musical development happening in utero in many, and you're one of a few people that I don't that seem to be really 2 years old. You're kind of off the scale a little bit, learning by ear, right? That's a pretty heavy skill to have early on in life, and then I haven't found too many people that have that and didn't get some kind of relatively daily musical dose
one thing
before
that
they're
Emily
born or
mentioned
soon
that
after.
I've brought up a lot on the podcast is watching movies repetitively. Kids do this a lot, especially obviously Disney movies. But I think
Disney movies.
I think when you start watching the same
gosh.
Disney movie 2 to 3 times a day, that's full of amazing music, amazing patterns. Some of those just start getting burned into the mind, and I think this is how I probably predominantly learned to audiate. I mean, you're like listening to like an hour and a half LSA 2 to 3 times a day for months on end. Those patterns, like I've mentioned this before, there's some patterns from like John Williams in Home Alone, like weird, not atonal, true atonal, but weird stuff, right? Just the tonal centers all over the place, like God knows what meter it's in. And those are just like been firmly in my mind since I was like 6, and so I think that is probably a part of what is at play, at least, or what was at play for you growing up.
Oh, I completely agree. And actually, so I remember this really well too. It must have been right around the time that I started lessons. So The Lion King came out. And I remember seeing the trailers leading up to it, and the music was just so captivating. And, the announcer, music, or original music by Elton John, pop superstar. And I'd see him playing on the piano. And I went around telling everybody, I'm going to be an Elton John pop superstar. I thought that was his name. I was just hooked on that music. To this day, I can play anything from The Lion King. And I mean, all of those 90s Disney films, they're all burned into my brain. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I've mentioned this too, but my first experience with the instrument, other than my first experience with the saxophone, I mean, I used to copy my brother all the time on piano when I was younger, but with the saxophone, it was all Disney stuff, and I knew all the songs. So, I mean, the sheet music was there, but I didn't need it. Like, I could, if I had the first, okay, it starts on this E, I could just figure the rest out. Like, the sheet music was really, just kind of like a loose guide. I wasn't taking it literally, but really just using your ear. Yeah.
Right.
And I don't get to see that a lot.
Right, exactly. And actually, so I certainly went through the typical period, teenage years, and like my teacher was wanting me to practice X amount of time a day and all this stuff, like very typical piano. And I just didn't want to do it. I would sit at the piano for hours a day, but it was all playing by ear. And my mom, it was the constant parent-student practice battle in the house. I'm sure you have heard about this many times. And I finally yelled at my mom, I want to quit piano. And, in typical bratty preteen form, I told her, I can already play anything I can hear. Why do I need lessons? Mm-hmm. She didn't really know what to say to that, except, well, you don't get to quit.
I think there's a really
and
interesting...
looking back on it, it's like, okay, like...
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, that makes sense. I mean, I think part of the problem, it gets further...
it makes sense, yeah.
It goes further down the hole when, like, someone who's naturally audiating very well at a young age, like you or like when I was, you don't necessarily have a teacher that can audiate as well as you can. Maybe they have lots of achievement in terms of their instrument and stuff, but I wonder what it would have been like for you or me had you had a teacher who could audiate well. I don't even mean an MLT teacher. I just mean someone who could really improvise well and play by ear. They would 100% acknowledge and respect, because when I have students that can improvise well and play by ear, I really see what they can do. And I try to pull the parents aside and say, like, I want them to learn to read music and do all the classical piano stuff. Let's do it. But there's something that they're doing that this other training is not accounting for that should really be respected here, because it's not common even in accomplished, performance majors. And yeah, I mean, so there's that.
I've wondered that too, because I look back on it now, and of course, we didn't understand all of that. Like, I'm not blaming anyone for what was missing in my childhood music education, but yeah, I mean, I definitely, I was doing formal lessons. There wasn't really any room for improvisation and composition, and as well-intentioned as my teacher was, I don't think that was a world that she was in or really cared to be in. She was very much about, let's learn the classics, let's learn the technique, let's, all the typical stuff that you get in formal training. And I remember, I don't know if it came from my teacher or just the formal community, but there was actually like this very biased view that, oh, that kid that plays, well, they're a Suzuki kid and they're cheating. They don't know how to read music. They're only using their ear. There was like that. I was taught that judgment very early on, and I know everyone has their opinions about Suzuki, but I mean, it is primarily, it's a sound first, ear first. Like, I remember hearing that and like, okay, so I'm not supposed to like Suzuki. Let's be judgmental of that. But at the same time, wait, I do play by ear. So what's wrong with this? Am I cheating? Am I bad? And I was a rule follower as a kid. So I think that's one of the reasons that the improvisation and everything was squashed out of me for a while. That it's like, oh, I better not do that. I'm breaking rules if I do that. I need to read the page. I need to, to follow everything that, as it's supposed to be done, which is interesting because now as I've read about the history of all these great pianists like Clara Schumann, no, they Mozart, they were going by ear first. They weren't.
Well, that's what I find so fascinating is when you really start digging into great classical composers. It's so ironic that classical pedagogy in terms of like piano performance or whatever performance, it's so not typical to add improvisation, but probably the best audiators, like period, that have ever lived were classical musicians. I mean, you could make a case for some jazz musicians and some other musicians, but there's no doubt that some classical musicians are at the complete peak of that conversation. But yet the tradition that, yeah, exactly.
Franz Liszt.
People are insane.
Just take one guy.
I find that so, ironic. And it's just mind-blowing in a certain sense. And
I mean, you hear accounts of like Mozart composing entire movements to his operas or symphonic works in his head. And actually, he was composing when he was younger. It was his father and his sister that were transcribing it. He wasn't. He didn't know how to read and write music yet. And then you've got Beethoven, who was completely deaf by the end of his life. So he was able to notate, but of course he's composing everything mentally. And that's not improvisation, but just the audiation skills with these guys is just incredible. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Clara Schumann, I don't know how much you've read about her. She's fascinating. I'm deep diving into that more and the implications with the parallels with language acquisition and how we learn by ear. It's just, really interesting. Yeah. So I don't remember his early childhood, but he came to be, a student of Clara's father at one point. Sorry. Excuse me. Clara's father was a renowned pedagogue at that point, and he had been teaching his daughter, and so Robert Schumann came to study with him, and that's how they met.
Okay.
Well, there were a lot of them like that were inspired by the countryside and nature, and I mean, he may very well have been one of them. I feel like a lot of the romantics were that way, and especially when you get into Impressionism and all that stuff. That's a whole other rabbit hole I could go down. I'm really big into teaching the music history to my students as well, and I have a storybook library, like specifically music storybook library, that is too big for me to store at this point, and so there's always a book of the week, and we're learning about a new composer, and anyway, sorry, that's a tangent, but
that's cool.
A bunch of them, is you hear bird calls and things and their pieces, that's what they were inspired by.
So I'm wondering, Emily, if you had you kind of mentioned this already, but when I was younger, I had the concept of audiation, I had not worked out to the degree that's talked about by Gordon and stuff like that. But I could tell when someone was audiating and when they weren't. I had already made, when I was 12 or 13 and I was in concert band and classical guitar lessons, I could tell when people were playing things like through imitation or when they could actually audiate. And I noticed that almost all the musicians around me in high school weren't actually audiating the things they were playing unless they were melodies that were like really, really well known to them at the time. And this is something I've seen a lot of musicians who, could audiate on their own without the guidance of an MLT teacher. They formed the concept of audiation like long before they got introduced to Gordon or MLT, just from their own experience interacting with people. And sometimes I would be around a really amazing musician that could improvise and play from memory, and just they're like a freight train. That's the way I like to think about it. And then you'd notice other people aren't like that. And I eventually learned to distrust all teachers that could not audiate, even though I didn't have the right words for it. I could tell when I had a good sense of when they couldn't, and I would distance myself from those teachers, And so I'm wondering, it sounds like you had similar observations when you were younger. I'd be curious to hear.
I did. I think so. I'm looking back on it. I had teachers that I knew could not audiate, and I was not terribly impressed with them, but I don't think I was consciously, obviously I didn't know what the word audiate was, but that's an interesting point. Okay. So I think I was like subconsciously probably distancing myself a little bit. Like I remember having many different music teachers through school and whatnot, where it's like, this could sound horrible, but I was like, okay, this guy does not know what he's doing. I know way more than him. Like, I remember having that thought a million times about different school music teachers and whatnot. And
unless the program you were in so heavily filtered out people that couldn't audiate.
So the program I was in was really, really unique.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in a very unique program. So what happened, my college story is a little interesting. I started as a piano performance major, and that was in a very typical department. I won't get into too many details, but let's just say it's amazing that my piano teacher at the time did not completely turn me off piano for the rest of my life. It was a very toxic relationship. I knew I needed to get out, and I actually ended up at another college within the university, the College for Creative Studies, which they pride themselves on being like this very small graduate school kind of environment, but for undergrads. And it is like literally... for our graduation ceremony, no one wore caps and gowns. We made up a song sampling like the voice of the dean of the college and improvising over it. Some guy at the graduation ceremony as like living art dumped a bowl of oatmeal on his head. It was one of those kinds of places. It was very off the beaten path. So it was a very unique environment. It was not a traditional composition department. That being said, my composition instructor, I think she had her I think she had her doctorate from Michigan at that point. Like she had a very formal training. I don't know if she was audiating or not. That wasn't something we really talked about.
And it could be a degree, right? Like I've noticed certain composition students, there's some things that they're audiating well, and then other things they're incorporating into their music is very much not of that flavor. It's much more cerebral and logically invented.
Right.
Not that that's necessarily bad.
It almost sounds
it's not
more like. Yeah, I think it was a lot of experimentation that I was hearing in my composition department. So like, oh, now we've learned about 12-tone rows. Let's integrate that into our music. Or let's see what we can do trying to compose something in the structure of a fugue. So it was a lot of sound experimentation, I think, probably more than audiating. But I know that there were definitely audiators in the department. I heard some amazing stuff. There were some really fantastic musicians there. But yeah, it was just... That's a hard one to look back on it and know for sure what was going on.
Yeah, and I mean, when I was younger and I was experiencing this, it wasn't like I had full-blown concepts for this. It was more just these little moments where I'd be observing other musicians playing and thinking, like, something's not right. And, it wasn't like a grand theory at that point. Yeah. It's just now that I look back on it with the proper vocabulary to pin on what was going on. It's clear that I was, picking up on something wasn't going on. Or like my brother, for example, is a pretty good audiator, and he can play in different tonalities, and he's got he's good at improvising and stuff like that. And so that always just seemed normal to me in the sense. And then in high school, especially, I started encountering musicians that didn't play music like that. My aunt's a great audiator, and she's an amazing musician. And so, I was around some people that were, and my main guitar teacher was a great audiator. And then there's other people that it seemed like they were playing music in a different way. And so I guess, at some level it started just not putting people in like really judgmental boxes, but you start, I don't know, something just doesn't seem right.
No, I see what you mean. Yeah. I think had I been in I'll just say less judgmental musical upbringing, I might have noticed that actually, that I think I always just use my formal knowledge to explain stuff away, like, oh, they just need to work with the metronome more, their rhythm is off, or oh, they haven't studied that passage enough. And so I would start regurgitating the things that I would like hear my teachers saying, instead of actually stopping and understanding, well, there's that. I mean, honestly, until more recently, I didn't understand that there was a name for what my brain did. I just sort of referred to it as playing by ear, and that was the end of it. So I think that there's been, I've had a lot more awareness of this really just in the last few years, because, here, let me back up. I've always known what I could do, but I've had more awareness of like this skill in general in music just in the last few years, as I've really broadened my horizons and opened myself up to everything that I was kind of shielded from in formal training. So hopefully that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and especially if you've been teaching for so long too, I could see, I mean, because if you're playing by ear and that was so natural for you, and then whether you're trying to teach other people how to do that, or seeing that some can, but some can't, it starts getting really interesting when you're teaching full time, right?
Teaching is really what broadens. Yes, teaching is what has taught me so much. It wasn't, I mean, not to say I didn't get stuff from my teachers as a kid, of course I did, but I've learned so much more now being a teacher, especially becoming a mother and then a teacher. It's just, I feel like so much has grown for me as a musician, as a teacher, my understanding of childhood development and how our brains work. I just had this new passion for it that wasn't there before. So
yeah, that's what has me stay in teaching, is how children are learning. When they're learning, it's like if you're clued into that, then whatever you teach is going to automatically plug in. If you're aware of the stages that the children are in, whether it's audiation or psychological or physical, all the different things that you can add, knowing from where the child's coming. So where did
MLT show up on your radar? You said it's been a few years or so, like take us through this, take us through what's changed? Where did you find this group and this information and stuff like that?
So I was actually, I don't even remember what I was reading. I mean, I've been into just my own self-paced professional development for a long time. So I was reading some article or writing somewhere, and I came across the word audiation. I didn't even have to look up I did look it up, but I didn't even have to look it up. It was like this light bulb went off, like, holy crap, that's what I do. It was like someone just gave me a name that I had been looking for, but I didn't know I had been looking for. And then you can imagine I go and look up audiation on Google, and of course it wants to switch it to the word audition. Like autocorrect is not like the word audiate. Of course then I start finding Edwin Gordon, and I didn't know the scope of his research at the time, so I was just like printing off freebie articles and starting to read them, and it turns out those were like from the 70s or whatever, and I started digging further and further into all of this, and I came across Gimel, and when I started reading the science about all of this and how our brains just, like this optimized learning, it's not that, everything I've learned is wrong, but there's a better way to do it, an optimized sequence to take it in. yeah, I just completely like overnight flipped everything on its head for me and how I was approaching things with students. And I feel like I'm like jumbling up the story here. It's like there's so much to unpack there.
Mm-hmm. Like in terms of teaching, because it sounds like you were, like you said, self-paced education, probably constantly expanding your methods and theories and all that. But then, was there a big change in terms of, I mean, how did your private teaching change?
Oh my gosh. I think I had mentioned to you before about I dropped methodology books several years back. I realized that they were not working anymore for me in my studio. So already I think I was kind of starting to, head down this direction. But once I learned about MLT and really started to grasp like the listening and the auditory skills first, and the reading and writing comes so much later, I started like taking the page off the music stand and saying like, we're going to listen to this right now. We're just going to feel this. We're going to move with this. And I had parents start to challenge me a little bit, like, when is my kid going to learn to read? What are you doing here? And I've had to direct them to different resources and, a podcast and things to listen to about here's what's happening. Here's why we're doing this. But I started getting everybody to start swaying to beats and feeling things and just listening and flooding their ears with the sounds of their songs. And I would say over the last 8 months or so, because that's really how long I've been starting to transition everyone. At this point, I hardly have anybody that is training for piano evaluations anymore. We've thrown that out the window, and that may very well come back. But right now it's like, no, let's work on these basic fundamental things with songs that you are enjoying, that just feels good, that's setting you up for success and positive experiences. And I've had several new students come to me since I started doing this, and they're like, wow, this is so different from what we've done in lessons before, and this is so much fun. And I think overall people have responded really well to it. I've definitely had some parents that are questioning it a little bit, but once I start talking about the science and why I'm doing what I'm doing, they seem to be pretty accepting.
Yeah, definitely. I actually love having transfers.
There's so much
totally. No,
there.
it's a big question. I feel like you could talk. I mean, I feel like I could talk about that for like 10 hours straight.
I'm still transferring everything over, honestly. Like,
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Are there standard, pieces that you do give your parents? Is there a list of, here, I want you to help me understand why you're doing this, and you give them, like you said, a podcast or books or reference materials.
Yeah.
What are their standards of those that you use?
So, I mean, first I try to just explain it to parents, because that one thing that I think I'm pretty good at is meeting somebody where they're at, so I can tell, like, if I'm dealing with a parent that comes from a background in education, I can talk to them in more detail about this than, someone who doesn't know any of that. So first I just try talking with them, but then if they want more information, so actually there was a great episode on Everyday Musicality that Heather posted. I think it was one of the weeks where she wanted to post something but was really busy and couldn't do her own podcast. So she posted an interview that she actually did. I'll see if I can find the episode for you later. And I'm so sorry, I forget who she was being interviewed by, but the whole point of that interview was explaining MLT and childhood music development to parents. So it's like this 45-minute thing. So I'll tell parents, like, hey, if you are curious and want to learn more, this is very well worded. It's this great, like, 45-minute episode that really dives into it at a parent level, not like a high educated educator level. But yeah, that's a good one. I'll certainly refer them to the Gimel website, but I do think it's easy to get lost on there too. Sort of be like, what should I be looking at here? But yeah, I think that episode in particular is a good one if people are looking for more
you almost
info.
need like a 4 parents filter.
I really do need to make a 4 parents resource, and I know a lot of teachers do that. I just haven't yet, because right now I've got a full studio. I've got 40 students, and I'm actually about to take on the music department at an elementary school here in town. So plus I'm a mom to 2 kids, so I'm a little busy at the moment, but I need to make a parent resource.
Yeah, I mean, I have found that most parents respond pretty well to the analogy between learning a language and learning to audiate. And, you know, I often just mention...
They do.
Yeah, I mean, and that's usually the first conversation I have, and I try to have it multiple times to kind of keep it online, because it's very easy for someone to hear that once and then 3 months later be like, well, why isn't Johnny reading music yet? And...
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, that could be one thing to navigate.
Yeah,
for sure.
and I lately the way I've been having that conversation is I'll actually have it with the student and then intentionally with the parent right there. A lot of parents like to sit in on the lesson, be like, okay, so, you know, before you're even born, what's the first thing you're doing with language? And like pointing to my ears and, you know, we're listening, we use our ears. I'm like, yeah. And then, you know, what he's like, I walk them through the whole thing. So by the time we get to reading and writing, I'm like, so how old were you? Like, when in school did you learn to read and write? And, you know, they start doing the math and realizing, so, you know, maybe learning their alphabet like in preschool. I'm like, okay, so you were 4. So you had 4 years of listening before you even learned what the letters were, and, you know, talking through it like this with them. And I find actually having that conversation with the student, with the kid, like the parent absorbs that even easier, like when they're listening to this whole thing. Now, the other thing that I'm able to do, which I find helps, so I'm sure you've experienced this, Beau, that students will be like, oh, can you play this song for me, or do that? It's like you turn into the human karaoke machine. And so my students know I can play by ear, and I'll bust something out for them. And then, now I'm able to explain to them the reason I can do that is because I've developed my ear. What we're doing is going to develop your ear so you can learn how to do stuff like that too.
Oh, I mean,
that will grab their attention, and that will stop the parents' line of questioning.
that kind of proof of concept, I have found so many parents, especially ones who have taken piano lessons for a couple of years and then failed, because there's so many parents that like that. When they know, a lot of parents respect.
Oh my gosh! If I had a nickel for every parent.
But yeah, having that skill set where you can actually do that, and I have found it difficult to when someone is like, "Oh, can you show me how you teach?" Like using MLT and some of this other stuff you're talking about. It sometimes is difficult to explain to other teachers, because I pretty much just ask students to show me something off of their playlist, because a lot of my students are teenagers, 13, 12, kind of up. And I just figure out how to play on the spot what they're playing and then teach it to them. And it can be hard to, if another teacher doesn't have the audiation skills to do that, it's not really a style of teaching you can engage in, because for people without those skills, that can be profoundly uncomfortable, you know. And then it just starts snowballing. You do this for 10 years and you get better and better and better at it. And I find a lot of parents do really respect when they know, they might not know what audiation is, but they're like, wow, his teacher or his or her teacher can just play songs that they listen to. Like it's an actual fluency thing here. And for me, that gives, if you have the scientific, you know, educational logic behind it that you can steer them with, and then you have the street chops to back up what you're doing.
Right.
People tend to understand, but it can take some reminding and educating, especially once parents start driving kids into the exam culture. And that can be a thing to navigate, you know, like in North America, it's usually Royal Conservatory stuff, but navigating that, because some of the educational goals for the Royal Conservatory, like I do some piano, I'm mainly a guitarist, but for Royal Conservatory, but some of the goals are like wildly inappropriate for the preparatory levels. Like they are insanely inappropriate.
Oh yeah, I agree. Although I will say, I think that, you know, unfortunately, the system that we have here in California, and I think I speak for almost every teacher in California, it's even more wildly inappropriate. I've switched everyone over to RCM.
Yeah, I think the RCM has gotten better.
They start theory testing at the preparatory levels here. At least RCM waits till level 5.
Well, I mean, there's still theory that goes along with every grade, but you don't formally have to take it to pass the grades until grade 5. Yeah, so basically you can just do no theory until grade 4, until grade 4 or 5 kind of thing, and they can still get their certificates for those grades. But now I have students who are in that situation where they're in grade 5 and they're great audiators, and we just go back and it's like, they already know a lot of the theoretical labels for stuff because it starts crossing over with verbal association.
Well, if you're sequencing it right, they're learning the theory. They just don't realize they are. They're not learning it formally.
Yeah, but yeah, that can be another conversation to navigate. But I mean, like you said, you have. I went through a period where I was like, when I first got into MLT years ago, where I really had no students doing exams, and now I have a handful, 7 kind of thing, and it.
Yeah, I do see the advantages to exams. I'm not against them by any means. That's not what I'm saying. I can just see like my studio's in a period of flux. There's like, okay, let's back this up. From now on, I really don't want to recommend that students go in for exams until they really have that solid foundation and they're audiating basic things like their beat and being able to just keep
without
a
a question,
tempo. If they're not doing that, they're not ready to go into an exam culture. It's just setting them up for lots of anxiety and just a bad experience.
I do think there's an art to choosing the pieces they play in exams too, because you can, if you're familiar with the repertoire, in the first few grades especially. Because you need to lay down a very positive experience with the first few exam grades, I think. There's things that are actually pretty easy to audiate in there. And that lineup, you could sequence it with your tonal goals, especially. And then there's things that are so inappropriate for those levels.
So the study group I'm in right now with Hannah Mayo and Krista Yadro is specifically for, piano, RCM, Prep A and B. We're going through those books and learning how to sequence them through an MLT lens, which is just
my God,
awesome.
I wish I had
I'm not ready
joined that group a few years ago.
Yeah, you might want to reach out to them. It might not be too late to join in. We're about to do week 3
I feel good
Friday,
about it now that I'm very
fantastic.
familiar with that repertoire. I have I just make them a curated list. I'm like, you can listen to all these and we'll play any of these you want, but these are the ones that you're really gonna, jive on. And it's usually accurate. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, that's been awesome to just start working through all of that material and then applying those skills to the pieces that the students are choosing as well. But yeah, I'm still very much in the thick of it, transitioning everyone over. But I will say, as mentally exhausted as I am and as much work as I'm doing with all this transition, I was enjoying my job before, but I'm enjoying it so much more now. It's like I'm nerding out on music and childhood education every day.
Yeah. My experience with teaching when I got into MLT, it totally changes the way that you teach. But teaching, once you start getting into music pedagogy and educational pedagogy, every lesson, like you might have a big concept on your mind that you're just kind of obsessing over, and every lesson becomes like an opportunity to observe that. And it might not even be music like MLT related. Like when I was getting into interleaving and the spacing effect, like I wanted to test those things with my students, and the lessons just become so fun because you're always working on something that you're intrinsically interested in yourself.
Well, the latest one I've been testing out, so Eric, you'll appreciate this. Now that I've been listening to your podcast, I was playing around with the yes-no game a little bit and seeing, okay, so what functions can they audiate? Because I've always been, especially being on piano, harmonic audiator all the way. That's my jam.
Yep.
Yeah, so we've been having a lot of fun with that, and I've been playing around with using like the yes/no labels, or sometimes like the older students that came from some more formal trainings. Like, okay, so here's the 1, here's the 5. We just do function numbers.
Yep.
But it's amazing, some of the students, especially the really little ones, that within 5 minutes, I think I was playing around with tonic dominant, subdominant, and then I think we threw in a relative minor. And it within just a couple minutes had all of them down. And it's like, all right, I'm going to stop you at 4 functions today, but that was really good. And then some of my older students were really struggling just on tonic and dominant. It's like, okay, like I wasn't saying anything like judgmental to them, but like for me to know, all right, now I know what we need to back up and work on.
It's crucial. It's an indicator.
Oh, yeah. So that's been my big obsessive thing lately after listening to you describe your game several times on the podcast. Just, I'm going to try this week, and it's been fascinating. Yeah,
it's cool. Cool to hear you use it. I hope it gets used more and more.
Well, I'd love to deep dive more into it. I mean, obviously, I've just got like a very surface understanding from what you've explained here. But yeah, I think I agree with you guys that it seems like a piece that's really missing from a lot of the curriculum with MLT. And I haven't even seen it so much in Music Moves, is that harmonic emphasis. And especially being a pianist, this is a harmonic instrument. That's such an important thing.
Yeah. Marilyn Lowe, she took my class on harmonic learning sequence? She? Yeah, and we talked, a fair amount. It's like, but the overwhelming amount of work she did, it's like, now we got to add this? It's kind of like, whoa. And this was, 4 years ago?
Yeah, I mean,
3 or
obviously
4.
if you've...
But what a great woman.
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, I came to this so recently. I never met Marilyn. I never met Dr. Gordon. But what I do know, just from what everybody who has known them so well has said, is they really wanted this to keep evolving. That, Gordon didn't do all this research saying, that's it, that's, figured it out, we're all done. And I doubt Marilyn was writing her books in that spirit either. Like, they wanted this to be a constantly growing thing.
I think that's a really good point. And it's very nice to hear someone, that we don't even really know very well, like you in the community, mentioning that, because the amount of times I disagree with something that Gordon said or whatever, and I'm always going off about pitch letters and, harmonic functions are different than tonal patterns and all this stuff. It's in the spirit. It's not out of disrespect or saying that they didn't know what they're talking about. It's just, if you could do things a different way and get different results. And if the results are better than maybe what they were prescribing initially, I feel like we all have to step back and say, like, something's interesting going on here. I don't know that'd be another interesting thing to hear your opinion on, just from being a good audiator, tonally and harmonically, is that I'm really convinced that it's better to learn movable do with a law bass minor and a pitch letter system. I think there's comparisons you can't make very aptly using movable do. And I feel like I'm almost talking into a void when I speak about this with people. But most of the people I know in MLT communities haven't tried playing over pieces that use extensive amounts of secondary dominance, and they don't see the value of pitch letters. But I'm not saying not to use movable do and all that. But I don't know what your experience is with, because it doesn't sound like you have any difficulty navigating the keyboard using pitch letters unless you were using. Yeah.
I don't. So I just listened to this episode that you guys were talking about this with the pitch letters, and how a lot of high-level jazz improvisers will be audiating with the pitch letters. And I was listening to that like, that is what I do. I always have it in my head that I'm like cheating the system somehow. It's like, no, your brain's just more efficient, Emily. Learn, like, you're not cheating. So, like, when I'm audiating something, for example, if I just want to like audiate the Dorian scale, I actually am imagining just like starting on a D and playing up and down. I've got this visual keyboard in my head that is like very fine-tuned. I can feel it in my fingers. Pitch letters, I audiate pitched letters. Like, it's not a problem. I know that, F sharp is a fifth above B. I know that E is a fifth above A. I have it down. And I think it's because that's just how I learned. No one was teaching me solfege until I watched The Sound of Music. And of course, then I thought it was just from that. It wasn't until very recently that I learned, oh no, that guy that invented notation actually also invented solfege. And that's how it was all anyway, sorry, tangent. But yeah, so I definitely audiate in pitch letter. I think it depends on the person. I think you can have people that are able to audiate off of pitch letter, but I don't think everyone can do that. So I think it's about being flexible and recognizing that we do hear tonally. Even when I'm audiating by pitch letter, I'm hearing tonally. I don't have perfect pitch. I can't listen to something and say, oh, that's a C5. But I can, in my brain, take that pitch that I heard and just like assign it to a note on the piano and then see where everything else goes. Yeah,
exactly. And totally. And I'm not against the whole logic and everything about movable do with a law bass minor. My only pushback is that sometimes there are really extreme claims being made in MLT circles that you can't audiate with pitch letters, and that to do it is detrimental. And it's just empirically false if you look at,
I disagree
because there
with
are
that.
musicians that do it. So just, it's a failure in proof of concept from the beginning. And it's not just like... it's not just some musicians. There's like a mountain of really skilled musicians that can do it. And so, but I think that it can be very difficult reconciling that with traditional learning sequence, because the way like in partial synthesis that we make comparisons between major and minor and tonal patterns, you actually have to change your method if you're using pitch letters, or you can create giant amounts of confusion. But I think you're right on the money. It's the flexibility is what's important. And
do the pitch letters become a verbal associate, so that they're a tone, and they're not related to, like do, or a system that's.
Yes, I think what happened...
That you could transferable.
Oh, yeah. So for me, the keyboard became transferable in my head. And so I already knew, like, this is C, this is D. Like, I had all that down. But, so, like, if I was listening to a song and trying to figure out what it was, I think because my hands were most comfortable just playing in C, I would audiate the resting tone, and then in my head just assign that to where C is on the piano.
So that's what I do. That's what I learned to do naturally, and that's what Andy Mullen learned to do as well. He would think of things in C and kind of like a relative tonality thing in C, like C major, A minor, and then just through enough practice, you immediately know how to turn C into something else. And after you're skilled enough at that, it's something else in terms of another key. Yeah. After you're skilled enough at that, they're equal in your mind. Like when I think of G patterns and C patterns, it's not like the C is more comfortable necessarily. It's just you have so much fluency going back and forth. It's just all the same. And then the movable do just in my head gets added to that. And I think that I don't think Gordon.
That's it. I would completely
I don't think Gordon was ever
that.
saying don't use pitch letters. I think it's more of a question of when is it appropriate to actually introduce this into someone's practice. I think it really depends on what someone's doing. Because for Eric, it might be wildly inappropriate because like most of your lessons, Eric, are like you do use instruments, like tonal instruments. But if I was in your situation, I would not introduce pitch letters at the rate that I do. I'm more comfortable doing it on the piano and the guitar because you can actually, like you were saying, Emily, you can see that these scales or patterns are literally visually transferable to other keys. I think it really helps to have an instrument to do that with, very much so.
Oh, I completely agree. If I was just teaching singing, there would be absolutely no reason to get into pitch letter. But with the piano, I mean, what are you going to do? You've got these 88 black and white keys in front of a student. Are you going to tell them just start on this one in between the two black notes? Like, you're going to tell them, well, we call that a D. And you can just leave it at that. But, I mean, eventually, just through repetition and practice, like, they are going to learn all the pitch letters. And I think that's how I approached it, was the pitch letter was basically just functioning as solfege for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think Gordon gets short shrift here because he railed so heavily against the teaching of names of notes in the public school setting. And that was like this grand, piece of his, commentary was how much damage we were doing not giving kids the opportunity to learn by ear. So I think when you make that your strong case for so long that it becomes anti-pitch letter, but in the Jump Right In books, it's C-do or G-do or F-do, you're naming at least where you're starting right away.
And I think that's a great way to start introducing
verbal
letters.
Association. And and there's just no... There's to me, there's no reason for him to have gotten to the point where us have gotten to the point where he's so anti-pitch letter. He's not. When it's appropriate, right? So it's like,
well, and the pitch letter thing kind of gets put in so with the decoding thing. They somehow become equated in people's mind, like And so I'm not advocating teaching decoding pitch letters on music notation. I'm just advocating, like, depending on someone's goals, especially if they want to be a serious jazz musician, I would just rather be very thorough and efficient, teach them pitch letters and movable do, and make sure that they can transition, when it's appropriate. But Eric, I think that's a really good point.
Oh yeah, I've got a student that just wanted to learn Skylark, that standard, and we figured out we're going to do it in G because he wants to sing along to it, and that's where his voice is. And we have all of the regular chord symbols on there, but then we went through and talked about the Roman numerals and what's actually happening with these patterns, and then did exercises like, just for the hell of it, let's try it on F, let's try it on D, you need to be fluid like that ultimately if you want to really be comfortable in jazz.
Oh yeah.
Or it just makes you a better musician all around, not just with jazz, but
yeah. And I do think there's really, there are easier comparisons to make, with the movable do system and a pitch letter system. But yeah, my only concern is like, I often hear people putting down, again, pitch letters, but then there's great audiators like you who have no problem using it. And in my mind, it's like, what were we doing that made pitch letters not a problem? And I mean, Eric's brought this up a lot. Maybe we were just so good at audiating, it just didn't matter. It's just...
I think that is part of it. I think that we were audiating pitch letters as a tonal system is what happened. That is ultimately how we absorbed it. And I think there are people
Go ahead.
I think there's people where that might be a struggle right off the bat, where it might be easier to start with something like... Especially if they're a little bit older, and so they already have a concept of what an alphabet is, and they're used to using letters to label things. Like, get out of letters. Like, start with something that's completely new, that's only assigned to tones. Yeah. And then we can work back towards the letter. Am I making sense?
And I mean, in defense of all this, I had like you, an absurd listening vocabulary and ability to figure out things by ear before I started labeling anything. And I think that's another part of this conversation that is important for me, is that when we look at the skill learning sequence, like the little charts, I feel like the oral should be like this big, like the entire page, and then everything else should be very tiny. But when everything is given the same physical space on the page, it really doesn't accent how important that first step is of just actually listening and moving and like you said, flooding your ears and copying patterns. And that's where all the juice is. That's where all the juice is. But it's cool to hear, from other musicians that are comfortable navigating the keyboard in that way, but you recognize the utility of other systems for when they're teaching, because rhythm-wise, for example, I never used rhythm syllables. I was fine audiating rhythm patterns using numbers and all that kind of stuff, but I'm much more on the side of use the rhythm solfege that Gordon said. Don't get into the other stuff now. That on that side of the conversation, I'm much more the actual practical application is just mind-blowingly obvious. That I don't have much to say.
Yeah, I am still so used to numbers for my rhythms, and I totally see the advantages of functional rhythm syllables. So I myself am still trying to just switch over and get used to the do days, do da d, all that stuff. I've been playing with that with my kids a lot because my son is 6 and my daughter is 2. And I was just hearing you guys talk about the doing ba 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 and everything versus bada 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 bada, and changing it up. So I was playing with that last night with them, and so I was still trying to figure out if I want to slightly alter the syllables a little bit for myself, just to make it easier in the mouth, not to change the function at all, because I do like what Gordon was doing. But I myself right now, I'm still so used to the numbers, the 1E and a 2E and a 3E and trying to get past that.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. I mean, if you've been using that most of your life, it's and no, this is related to what I was saying before, is if you're actually audiating the patterns that those labels are being pinned onto, to you it's just what's the problem? And that's a good point. It became, those are my rhythm syllables. So trying to switch out of that.
They just don't have the inherent logic, which gets messy when you got kids, right, that don't have the same listening repertoire. Because it ultimately doesn't really matter what you use, right? You can use anything as long as you're audiating the patterns. But how do you learn to audiate those patterns? It's easier to give them a verbal associate that makes sense so the child doesn't have to do as much work.
I completely agree
And one
with
end
that.
is a lot more work than
Eric,
the,
that's
than the
an
other.
insane point. I mean,
Because what's the
Yeah.
end of two kind of thing.
I mean,
But
the
that's-
point of the verbal associate is to make going through the stages of audiation very obvious. Like, we're labeling this the macro beat because you need to get to stage 2 of audiation, and this verbal associate makes that easier for the teacher to communicate with the student, essentially. Yeah. But curriculum design things, I think, eat up so much time for all kinds of teachers. When you've been teaching for God knows how long, 15 plus years, and you have curriculum that you use, and then now every time you get into new educational theories or ideas, you start like questioning, like, there needs to be curriculum changes here. And like, I have a friend who's a teacher in the school system in British Columbia. It's 4 or 5 years into his career, and it's a never ending, like curriculum existential situation where it's like, I gotta burn this down and start from scratch and burn this down. And that can be one of the nice things about MLT is like, when you know the principles, you don't really have to make your own method book and then follow it. Like, you can have repertoire that you use, you can have songs that you use, and a general plan, but it's flexible to the experimentation and updating of things. And that's why I don't use a method book. Even one of the like MLT concocted ones is like, it's hard to kind of reinvent the wheel every time, if you have a very strict curriculum. But I'm sure you've experienced that yourself with curriculum planning.
Yeah, So, I mean, like with music moves, it's sort of my intention with that, what I've been starting to do with it is not... I think the danger lies in like when you exclusively use something and don't add any of your own supplemental knowledge and pieces and experience to it. But if the method is like a piece of what you're doing, I think it's a lot easier to be flexible. Mm-hmm. And I do think that the way Marilyn designed music moves, so you have to teach it a certain way, but there's a lot of flexibility within that, if that makes sense. Like, I think every MLT practitioner, piano teacher teaches music moves a little differently, and that's okay. Like, it's designed to be tailored by the instructor.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's a great way to use it.
It's a resource more than it is a method, but
yes,
it's still a method.
Yeah, it's obviously the closest thing to a method that I want to touch at this point with my students, but
Sure.
It's a very unique method. It's not like the conventional, lots of methods that we have out there.
Yeah, and I think a benefit for piano teachers who are into MLT to using something like that in their teaching is they can actually see, Gordon's ideas being implemented. And I think, if you just, like I did, I was just reading learning sequences in music and then trying to apply it, which is kind of insane when you think about it, because it's so theoretical. And then it's so far removed, even though he does do a pretty good job of showing you the practical. Like when you meet someone like Eric, who actually has a curriculum, or Marilyn, who actually has like a real way of implementing this, you pick up on things that you don't even notice. Like I mentioned this to Eric, the familiar patterns and familiar order thing is not really covered in learning sequences of music, but it turns out to be really important when you're delivering tonal patterns, and those are things that they're almost better learned by, even if you're not going to permanently use Marilyn's curriculum or whoever's curriculum, it can be useful to see it laid out like that. Like, how should I actually roll this out in my lessons?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The easiest way that I have found to be implementing these ideas and really grasping them has been through more practical application. I still have learning sequences sitting on my nightstand, and I tried to read it months ago, couldn't do it. I ended up doing Eric Bluestein's book instead, which was great. That was a great read, and I know everyone says, go to that if you can't do learning sequences. So I think I'm about to try to pick it up and do it again. But it's been, I took that summer course. So like doing the courses, looking at the curriculums that have already been done. I've got music moves. I've got jump right in since I'm about to start that music job. Listening to podcasts. This has been such a great resource. Oh my gosh. I wish that this had been around. Like, podcasting just wasn't really a thing. Not like it is now back when I started teaching.
Well, it's good. It's good to hear you've gotten something out of this podcast and, everyday musicality and stuff.
Yeah, this one, like Heather Schuldeis, hers is incredible. For any
good.
piano teachers that haven't found keys to music learning, that's a really good one too. I still need to go listen to Andy Mullen. I know everyone says that his is fantastic, all of his resources. Yeah. And even like the Facebook groups, everyone is so just active and dynamic on there. And I know, like in the early days, I was asking questions and pissed a few people off, but
yeah, I'm just virtually pissing people off. I'm not on any MLT Facebook groups. But adding more of a community element is, one of the best ways to increase intrinsic motivation. And I think, you're just a really good case study, an example of someone who can audiate well, gets into MLT, sees the value, it's changing your job, it's changing your teaching, hopefully making things more efficient and more enjoyable at the same time. And I think that's what, I think you're a good example of what people should hope for when they're getting into MLT. And maybe not everyone who's getting into MLT can audiate as well as you can, but then maybe it'll be even more valuable for them because they find it. And not only are they becoming a better piano teacher or whatever, they're actually learning to audiate themselves like radically different. For me, it's just made it more efficient, right? And I can push more content that I couldn't push in the same way.
Yeah, that's how I'm... Yes, and I'm finding ways to push my own audiation. Like, I would really love to be able to... do like better jazz audiation. I'm really good with the slower stuff, but anything fast, like it's just beyond me. So I'm definitely pushing myself more now, but yeah, for the most part, it's just taught me how to teach so much more efficiently, but I feel like it's really lined up with a lot of my instincts and just spoken so much to how I myself learned music. Every time I read something new, hear something new, it's just like, I resonate with that. It's just so much of it is like, this is what I was doing.
I remember a couple of years ago, I was working on some classical pieces for an exam, and there was this one weird, modern etude. Gerald Garcia has a series of classical guitar etudes that are just beautiful, and there's some really weird stuff going on tonally. And I was struggling with audiating the piece, and that's not usually the case for me when I work on something consistently. And I just like held open music learning sequences, and I was like, do I even know where the resting tone is in this part of the song? And that's 99% of the time, if you're struggling tonally, it's because you haven't done that. There's something has changed that you're not tracking. And literally all I did was just sing the resting tone. I listened to someone play it, sang the resting tone. I played it myself, sang the resting tone. I just did that for a couple of weeks. And I was audiating that part in a way that I wasn't before. Because every time I was working on it, I was hearing the resting tone being in a different place. But it's just like textbook stuff. It's not even... and... I mean, that's one of the benefits I see for, air quote, more advanced applications. Like I was still reading sheet music. I was decoding things and it was going well for most of it. But there's this like little 3-bar section. Like, I don't know what the hell was going on. And it just came down to singing the resting tone or singing the tonal center. But it's hilarious.
Yeah, I feel like, in piano and a lot of the more advanced repertoire, I see this like a lot in Debussy, that so much of it is about like textures. I actually, speaking of, I don't think I actually pissed anyone off, but we recently had a thread on there in comments. Someone was trying to teach, oh goodness, what was it? There's I think it's called The Snow is Falling. It's from Debussy's Children's Suite. I'm probably mixing up the name. Anyway, it's like all these different textures happening at once, and it's multimodal, and we were talking about how to audiate that. But yeah, I do have more advanced students that are wanting to play like those kinds of pieces. It's like we have to break through this cacophony of noise. It's like if they try to just decode it and stare at the page, they're not going to know what the hell is going on, and they get frustrated with it and burned out after a couple weeks. But yeah, if we actually like isolate each of the textures and hear what's happening, that there's really a melody in each one, and then we're trying to keep track of all of those simultaneously, ultimately when you pull the piece together.
Oh yeah.
It's a totally different experience.
You see this a lot with things that have harmony that just seems totally nonsensical. There's actually just a very simple melody in major or something like that, and then there's just really weird harmony applied to it. And so predominantly, like, I'm still just audiating it as like a major melody for most of it. But there's just the harmonic textures. It almost becomes like, you could call them functions, but some people, when they hear that, they can't even remain in major or whatever the background, audiated melody is. They get pulled away by, like you said, the cacophony of chords or textures, or like there's weird chords in parallel fifths, like up a whole step, and like it shouldn't be taking you out of the tonality, but for some reason it is. Like, and I don't know. I didn't talk to like half of these composers, but once you audiate it like that, it seems like that's probably what they're doing. Yeah.
Oh, it absolutely is what they're doing. I mean, when there's no way it's an accident that, like, hey, there's that C major triad in the middle of all of this. Like, that wasn't just coincidence. Right. But it's sort of going back to what you were talking about before, like noticing when people are audiating and when they're not. I think with advanced piano repertoire, that's one of the big giveaways, whether they're audiating or not. Are they making sense of this more advanced piece? Can you, as an audience member, listen to this and not like fall out of it? Can they like, what's the term? Can they like suspend the disbelief for the whole thing?
Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of the time you get these kids that like they're trying to do the robot thing and like sorry, my camera does that. They're trying to do the robotic thing where they're like just memorizing all the notes on the page, but you can tell they're not actually hearing the inner melodies and what's going on at all. They're not auditing that piece.
Yeah, and I mean, as a piano player, I'm sure you're very cognizant of students not audiating bass lines or inner harmony line. Like sometimes the melody is like there's like a faint audiation of the melody, and then everything else is just robotically being executed. And like sometimes I'll even play the bass line to a piece someone's been working on. Like they've been working on for a while, and they show me from like a previous teacher. I'm like, what is this from? And they just stare at me like blankly. Like there's not even a recognition of the bass line. Like it's wild. But yet they've been playing it for years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's interesting.
Right. Or like just, and teaching them the concept of like, here's what a motif is, and it's being carried throughout the piece. There's just no concept of that. Which, of course, all these great composers and simple and intricate works, they're all doing these same things, just at varying degrees of difficulty.
Well, it was honestly really fun to chat. I think anyone who has, you said you have about 40 students plus some new, school-based students coming in, but I think any student that gets in contact with you, I think is very fortunate. I think they're going to get a lot of their time with you, and yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Not only musically speaking, I think you just have a very good, open, analytical but flexible mindset towards education. I think people, are lucky to have you as a music teacher. Yeah.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Eric, any last words?
I had a roommate that was the son of George Crumb. And he couldn't audiate a lick.
So it's you don't pick it up by osmosis?
Oh my God.
That's one of the things that was in my mind from earlier that I never squoze in. So there's my last thought.
That it's not really a genetic thing, that it's more just you're born with whatever aptitude you're born with, and then it's an environmental thing. And so like... Yeah, it's both, form, function.
I was writing about this
function.
today.
Nature, nurture, form, function.
Just writing a little article about how I think teachers can get very confused about someone's aptitude, because when someone's at stage 5 and they can recall patterns from other songs and they're like, hey, that sounds like this. And so it seems like they can figure it out fast. I think there's a tendency for some teachers to think like they must have insanely high aptitude because they're learning it so fast, but they just might have these patterns in their vocabulary. And then the opposite can happen. We think that students don't have high aptitude because they're not figuring out things by ear, but maybe you're just showing them something that they don't have any patterns in their vocabulary.
That's where you get in trouble, conflating aptitude and achievement.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's why the aptitude measures are so valuable. Or you've got, and I'm wrestling with this, is like if you can teach somebody to their optimal and keep pushing right? You're gonna find their aptitude if you can do that.
But yeah, I don't have any of the tests right now, and I would like to get a hold of them. I'd be really curious about that. But yeah, one of the luxuries of being in a one-on-one teacher and doing so much individual work is I feel like you can start to break down, like, okay, so let's just sort of push, what's happening in your head right now harmonically and tonally and rhythmically, and see where you're at. So it's sort of like you're saying, Eric, that you can kind of figure it out. So as much as
Eric says I can't tell people's aptitude, the tests I've given students and friends so far have all been like on the money. So
I would argue, though, I don't think you can tell someone's aptitude just by listening to them play a piece. I think you need to have some one-on-one time with them and really.
I mean, I'm talking about students I've had for years,
and, know
right?
what you're doing.
I'm talking about people. I'm A and Bing stuff for them all the time, and I've seen over the course of years how they're progressing. And I mean, one of my friends who's an amazing piano player, amazing singer, I gave him a test because he's not in the MLT world, but he very much is aware of it. And 90th percentile rhythm and 92 or something harmony, and I'm not even remotely surprised here. The guy knows nothing about music theory, and the chord progressions he comes up with are just whoa. Like for pop music too, like it sounds like Elton John on steroids. Like Elton John took a harmony steroid or something. Yeah.
It's been really great talking, Emily. Anybody that's going after Azera's stuff and like that, and the piano, as a piano teacher, it's kind of clued me that you'd be okay to drink on.
Like I said, I haven't read it yet. I got the wrong book, but.
No,
I mean, you probably could have soldiered through the B flat copy, but I mean, why not?
I thought about it for a brief second. It's like, do I just do this? Do I just do the B flat copy? And it's like, I'm a good audiator, but screw it. Everything I know, every instrument, I do piano, guitar, voice. I've done a little bit of flute. Like, no, I'm not touching B flat.
I mean, it's movable dough, so you probably would have been fine. And then all the recordings are going to be.
Yeah, but then there's the damn notation that gets in the way.
Yeah, all the recordings will be out of whack too for you.
Yeah, exactly. So I hope that you're able to enjoy it. You're a trumpet player, right, Eric?
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. It's much better off in your house than mine.
Yeah. Well, I always get the C stuff, but it'll be interesting to have a B flat.
Right.
Because I don't want to. D is no longer C in my world, right? It's just a sound that comes out your horn.
Yep.
So, anyway, thanks again. It's really, really wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you.
We'll see you around the Facebook world.
Sounds good.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.